Brook might be the only Straw Hat who can actually save Gunko, or rather Princess Shuri, not by throwing hands with Emu, obviously. Brook's real weapon may be his music. More specifically, his music may reach the part of Shuri that Emu failed to fully suppress. And the reason I think that is because the more Oda reveals about Shuri and Brook's backstory, the more her story starts to resemble Uta's. And if that's true, then the story may reveal the real danger behind Emu's power from controlling people to hard rebooting your entire lore. But here's the important part. Brook and Shuri's bond was built through music, dreams, and freedom. But Shuri as Gunko is now basically the opposite of all that. So if Brook's music still causes any kind of emotional reaction in her, then Shuri may not be completely gone. She still exists underneath whatever Emu did to her. In fact, we've seen glimpses of that. And this is where Film Red becomes important. Yes, I know it's not canon, but let me explain. Uta was also connected to music, separation, and an absolute nightmare entity that weaponized her own headspace against her. Did Film Red predict Gunko? But it doesn't hurt to ask whether Oda is repeating the same emotional pattern of vulnerable girl becomes tied to a larger destructive force and music becoming the thing that still reaches the person underneath. So while we don't have the full answer yet, we're gonna talk about whether Brook's music, Film Red's Uta storyline, and Emu's control over Gunko are all connected to the bigger question. Can Shuri actually be saved? What's important about Brook and Shuri's relationship is how it was built through music. That matters because music may be one of the only things that can still reach her after Emu changed who she was. So, if Gunko exists because of Emu's control over Shuri, it makes sense to question whether Brook's music can reach the part of Shuri that Emu could not fully suppress. Brook is obviously not going to fight Emu directly, but Oda is clearly setting it up for this kind of role in the Elbaph arc. The deeper you look at Brook's story, the more this pattern starts showing up. Music in One Piece is almost never just for aesthetics. Oda keeps using it to preserve emotional connections even after people are separated for years or die. Brook's entire storyline is built around that idea. Bank Sake keeps the Rumbar Pirates and Brook connected long after they're gone. The Promise to Laboon survives because the song survives too. Now, Oda is tying Brook's music directly to Shuri, someone who barely acts like the person Brook originally knew. And that feels important, because if music keeps preserving emotional connection in One Piece, then Brook's connection to Shuri may end up being more than just backstory. His music may be the thing that helps the real Shuri break through the Gunko persona in the first place. And Film Red starts looking very different once you compare it to Brook and Shuri. Uta's relationship with Shanks was also built through music. Then years of separation, trauma, and misunderstanding completely changed that relationship. She was literally just leaving the front door to her subconscious unlocked for Tot Musica to abuse the shit out of it. That's where the comparison starts getting interesting. Both stories connect music to identity loss, emotional manipulation, and a larger force using a vulnerable person. You can see the same structure with Shuri. She's built a deep emotional connection through music, kills her father supposedly, disappears into Mary Joie, falls under Emu's control, and is now someone who barely resembles the person Brook once knew. The parallels get even stronger once you compare Tot Musica and Emu directly. Both of their designs use the similar imagery, the cloaked silhouettes, the horned demon features, the shadow-covered bodies, the strange eyes, and the unnatural proportions. Tot Musica feels less like a normal creature and more like a living curse. Emu's current appearance in Elbaph uses very similar language. Their roles in the story also feel similar. Uta slowly stops acting like herself under Tot Musica's influence. Emu also feels less like a normal ruler and more like a force built around suppression, control, and identity loss. This doesn't have to be a literal one-to-one parallel to matter. The emotional structure is already very similar. A girl connected to music becomes separated from the person who understood her the most, falls under the influence of a larger destructive force, and slowly loses herself in the process. That's why Brook fits so naturally into this conflict over Shuri's identity. Brook's entire character, like many characters in the story, represent the opposite of what Emu represents. Emu's control over Gunko is tied to suppression, control, and identity loss. Brook's music does the opposite. It reconnects people to memories, promises, and emotional bonds that survive separation and loss. Even Brook himself is basically built around that idea. I wouldn't blame him for giving up after his crew died, but his memories and emotional connections are what kept him going. That is why the Film Red comparison matters so much. Tot Musica and Emu both use vulnerable people while suppressing who they are. Brook stands on the opposite side of that idea. He represents emotional connection instead of emotional control. Speaking of emotional connection, if this video just altered your brain chemistry in any measurable way, leave a like, subscribe, click the bell, and help me continue ruining people's perception of One Piece permanently. Because if Imu's control over Gunko depends on suppressing Shuri's original self, then Brook may not need to physically defeat Imu for this role in the story to matter. He may only need to help Shuri remember who she was before Imu got to her. And this idea gets a lot more interesting once you start thinking about what happens next, because even if Brook's music reaches Shuri, that doesn't automatically mean she is free from Imu's control. It could actually make the situation worse. Like, imagine suddenly remembering who you used to be, reconnecting with the person who knew who you were before everything changed, and then getting dragged back into Imu's control again. And that feels much closer to the kind of emotional conflict Oda usually writes. Characters in One Piece don't automatically recover from trauma or manipulation because somebody says the right thing to them. Recovery is pretty messy and painful. So Brook's role here may not be to magically save Shuri in one scene. His role may be helping the real Shuri break through long enough to start fighting back against Imu's control. And at that point, the story stops being about whether Shuri still exists underneath Gunko. Now the question becomes whether Shuri can take herself back from Imu. And this also may connect to a bigger pattern in One Piece. The series constantly comes back to the same kind of tragedy. People getting misunderstood after falling under the influence of larger systems, conflicts, or inherited problems they couldn't fully escape. And that idea starts sounding very familiar once you look at Shuri. She was connected to music, freedom, and emotional connection, and then she disappears into the center of world power, falls under the influence of a larger force, and comes back as someone almost unrecognizable. That is part of why I believe the Joy Boy comparison feels important. Now, what do I mean by that? There's a lot of implications of betrayal involving Joy Boy during the Void Century, with the broken promise to the original Poseidon, to obviously his formerly amicable relationship with Imu way back when. But what if the real tragedy was misunderstanding the victim instead of understanding what actually happened to him? That possibility sounds very similar to what may now be happening with Shuri. Joy Boy was connected to the original Poseidon through the apology phonoglyph in Fishman Island, and most fans treat that apology as a failed promise involving Noah. But what if the situation was bigger than that? What if Joy Boy realized too late that Poseidon had been manipulated, weaponized, or falsely treated as a threat instead of a victim, similar to how Spandam weaponized Frankie's battleships in his backstory? It would be wrongful to label Poseidon a criminal simply because of her power. However, in the wrong hands, that power makes it very easy to paint her as a villain. And Brook's storyline starts mirroring that possibility in a really interesting way. Brook originally believed Shuri betrayed the Asperia Kingdom by murdering her father, but the story is increasingly suggesting that Shuri may have been controlled, manipulated, or stripped of her autonomy by Imu instead. And I think it's also important to call out the symbolic connection between Brook and Fishman Island. Oda even has Brook perform the Good Morn Maid song in Fishman Island, and again during the Asperia flashback over 70 years earlier. And the parallels keep stacking from there. During the Fishman Island moment, and again in chapter 1183, Oda gives Brook poses and visual framing that strongly resembles Sun God Nika. And to me, that creates a really interesting contrast and comparison between Brook and Joy Boy. Brook's entire character is built around refusing to abandon promises, no matter how painful things become. Joy Boy's legacy survives through an apology carved into the poneglyph. So Brook and Shuri may not just be parallels to Uta and Shanks, they may also parallel a much older tragedy between Joy Boy and Poseidon. There is still one major thing we don't fully understand: how Imu's control over Gunko actually works. And I have my own theory about it in this video right here. But depending on what Imu is controlling inside Shuri, it could completely change how we understand Imu's powers. Is Imu controlling her memories, her emotions, her personality, her choices, or all of them at the same time? And the story already proved that part of Shuri still exists underneath Gunko. But the bigger question is whether that version of Shuri can fully come back once it starts resurfacing. Again, that could end up being Brook's role in the arc, helping Shuri remember herself long enough to fight back. Now, imagine if Brook succeeds. Does Shuri fully come back? Does she start resisting Imu? Or does remembering who she used to be only make things worse? Because if Oda is building towards that kind of conflict, then Brook and Shuri could end up becoming one of the most important relationships in the Final Saga. So what do you guys think? Do you think Brook can actually bring Shuri back, or is Oda setting up another tragedy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out this video where I explain how we've already met the forest god in Elbaph. And no, I don't think it's Chopper.